Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we are going to be starting a new, very exciting project. If you watched my 2024 sewing goals video, then you'll know that I want to be a little bit more confident working with slippery fabrics and working on the bias. So today I wanted to try my hand at making a dress out of a slippery fabric. So I'm going to be using the McCall's M8382 pattern, which is a Brandy Joan pattern. She is the designer who created it. You can follow her on Instagram and I believe YouTube as well. And the pattern here is this stunning dress. As you can see, it has two different views. So it has a view that has cap sleeves on the shoulders or a sleeveless view, which is view B. And I want to sew up view B. I also like the longer length of that skirt. And the fabric I'm going to be using today is this really beautiful polyester satin fabric I got from Fabricland the last time I was there. It's really lightweight and it's got a great sheen on the front. As you can see, it's got a kind of forest green background with some flowers that have tan and like a rusty red-brown color. So I love the color scheme and I love the floral design of this fabric. I just have a little swatch to show you guys because I've actually already cut out the pieces for this pattern. And the reason I thought this fabric would work really well with this pattern is because this fabric has a lot of drape to it, and I really love the way the skirt of this pattern kind of drapes. It has princess seams in the bodice and it's kind of close fitting from the hips to the knees, and then it like ever so slightly flares out a little bit below the knees, which I think is going to be beautiful. And the other feature about this pattern that's really special is the neckline. So as you can see, it kind of has this really interesting curved shape at the bust, and then it kind of falls into a teardrop shape underneath the bust. So I think that's going to look very beautiful. Now, I must admit, I am a little bit concerned about the fit of this pattern. I was trying to find reviews online, and there are not a lot of reviews available. I did find a couple of videos. I'll link them below for you in case you're interested in seeing different videos about this pattern, but it seems like not a lot of people have shared their creations with this pattern yet. But I am a little bit concerned of the fit at the bust. So I guess we'll see as we proceed through the video kind of how I deal with that. I do have a couple ideas in mind of how that might work, but I will cross that bridge when I get to it. So the dress is fully lined and I'm going to be using the same fabric for the lining as well as the main dress just because I happen to have a lot of it, so I'm just going to use it up all on this dress. So in terms of sizing, I did cut out a size 14 with no modifications made. My measurements match the size 14 measurements perfectly on the envelope. However, I will say that I often measure as a 14 for McCall's patterns, but then when I sew them up, they seem to be a size too big. So sometimes I'm more of a 12, like the 12 tends to fit me a little bit better. So we'll see. But yeah, I am just so excited to get started on this project. It's been a while since I've made a really pretty dress and I just can't wait to dive into it. So let's get started. So I decided to make my lining first as a sort of practice run before making my main dress. So first I pinned the center front piece to the side front pieces right sides together, matching up the princess seams. I recommend to take your time here and really make sure that you're matching all of the notches correctly. I did experiment with basting the seam together, but I decided in the end just to go with a lot of careful pinning instead. I'm only going to show you the process of constructing the lining, but every step I did exactly the same for the main fabric. After I was done sewing, I pressed the seam open using my iron, and I used a pressing cloth to protect my fabric from getting damaged. Throughout this whole video, I'll be pressing all of my seams open unless I say otherwise, so make sure you're pressing your seams at every step, and you can see what a nice, neat result that gives. Then I top stitched both sides of this front piece. I wish I had also gone in and top stitched the keyhole neckline right away, so if you're making this project, I would definitely recommend you do that at the beginning. So next I sewed up the princess seams of the back pieces. So I took the center back piece and the side back piece, placed them right sides together, pinned, matching the notches, and sewed carefully along this side. And then I did this for both of the back pieces, leaving the center back seam open. This is where the zipper is going to go later. Once that was done, I cut some interfacing to go along the back neckline edge. And because I was working with such a delicate fabric, I decided to interface both my lining and main pieces. So I also decided to interface the lining of my lower cut pieces. I used a flexible woven lining for this. And for my main lower bust cup pieces, I didn't use any interfacing because I wanted the gathering along the lower bust edge to just fall more naturally. Because I plan to wear this dress without a bra, I think interfacing this piece is really important just for a little bit more opacity and bust support. So next we're taking this upper bust yoke piece and pinning it against the lower bust cup piece right sides together. Here you're matching two opposite curves together, so take your time, match your notches, and just use a lot of pins to make sure you get a really accurate sewing line. So next I decided to make the bust ties. So I cut out 2 strips of fabric on the bias, placed the fabric ends right sides together, and sewed all the way along the long edge. And I also closed up one of the shorter edges. Then I clipped the corners and turned it out to the right side and pressed it. Then we want to tack these ties down to each opening side on the center front piece. Here you can see I have some interfacing behind my keyhole just to keep it stable. So one thing I wanted to mention with these bust pieces is that when it came to pressing them flat, I did have to clip the seam allowances to get a nice flat finish. I've marked the notches on the wrong side here, and we're going to want to sew gathering stitches between these notches. I sewed 3 lines of gathering stitches, knotting up one end and leaving one end free to gather up this lower edge of the bust. Okay guys, let's pause here for a second to address the elephant in the room. What is going on with those unraveling seams? I am honestly so embarrassed to even show you guys this because this is completely unacceptable and out of control. I'm going to address these unraveling seams later on for the video, but for now I'm double checking my notches for the center front of the bodice. Now we need to gather the lower bust piece in between the notches so that the notches match up with those on the front bodice. For the main bodice pieces, the ties should be tacked on at this point. Just pin them out of the way while you're sewing this seam. Once my gathering was the correct length, I pinned my bust piece right sides together against the front bodice piece and sewed this seam. Once again, I did some aggressive clipping and notching of this curved seam, and then I pressed the seam open so that I got a nice neat finish from the right side. Next, attach the front and back bodice pieces along the shoulder seam. Note that at this point, the side seams aren't sewn on either the lining or the main fabric. Next, you're going to want to place your lining and your main right sides together. We're going to want to sew these together along the neckline, including the keyhole part, and we're going to leave about an inch or 2 free at either end. There's a notch to show you where to stop sewing along the back neckline. At this point, I took some time once again to clip and notch my seams, and I spent some serious effort pressing it from the right side to make sure that I'm going to end up getting a neat finish. Here's what it was looking like once it was all pressed. I would also highly recommend you take some time here to grade your seam allowances down at the center front, near where the bust ties are. You'll notice that the outside of the shoulders are not attached. Once you've taken the time to neatly press, turn the whole project back inside out. Now we're going to sew the lining to the main right sides together along the other side of the shoulder seams, but we're only sewing from each end about 3 or 4 inches in. There's a notch to show you where to stop sewing. And the reason for this interesting construction choice is that we're going to be turning the dress right sides out through these shoulder seams, so that's why we've left one side open so that it's easier to turn it inside out. Now, at first this was rather confusing. I've never seen anything constructed like this, but I have to hand it to the designer. This actually worked really well. I think if you were using a stiffer fabric though, you might have more trouble pulling it through your shoulder seam, so maybe you would want to leave yourself a little bit more room. Just something to consider. So when you turn the project back right sides out, this is what it should be looking like. The ends of that outside shoulder seam should be sewn up, but you should have a large point in the middle that is still not sewn together. We're going to press our seam neat now, and in the area that's been left open, we're going to turn our seam allowances under at 1 5/8 of an inch, which is the seam allowance for this pattern. And then we're going to need to do some hand stitching to sew this open area together. At first, I was really hesitant to do some hand stitching because I'm not very good at it. but I have to say it wasn't that challenging and the end result looks so neat and tidy. So I would highly recommend you take the time to hand stitch your project too. Okay, so here's what the dress is looking like at this point. So now it's time to sew up the side seams. And again, this is kind of a counterintuitive process. But basically, you're going to sew the side seams right sides together of the main fabric and the lining fabric. You should be able to sew this all in one continuous stitch. I'll put some diagrams from the actual sewing pattern up here. This is one of those things that will make sense a little bit more once you actually get to this point in the project. I was a little bit worried about this step, but once I got here, it totally made sense what I was expected to do. Okay guys, it's finally time to address these horrible unraveling seams. So finally, I recognized that the unraveling was getting extreme and it was hard for me to understand where the seam allowance ended. So I went over these seam allowances with some pinking shears to neaten them up as best I could, and it actually worked out really well. So our side seams have been sewn up and pressed, so that means it's time to sew the zipper in. So firstly, I pinned my zipper against my main fabric. And then I wanted to try the dress on just to make sure I was happy with the fit before I committed to sewing the zipper in. So here's me trying it on. As you can see, I had a ton of extra room in the bodice. I ended up taking out 4 inches from the top of the bodice near the bust line and about 2 inches near the waist and 1 or 2 inches near the hips as well. I'll talk more about the sizing in the end of the video. So I ended up taking this extra allowance out of the back. Technically, you should really try to take it out of the back and side seams, but I didn't mind just removing it from the back. So I pinned my zipper on once again with these new fit ideas in mind, and once I was happy with it, I sewed it on using my invisible zipper foot. Then I pinned the bottom edge of the main fabric right sides together and sewed up that seam below where the zipper was, getting as close as possible as I could to the end of the zipper. So apparently I didn't record this part, but I did also sew the lining piece to the zipper. I matched up the lining fabric right sides together with the main fabric, and from the lining side, I stitched as close to the zipper teeth as possible. The instructions here were fairly easy to understand. It's time to hem the bottom. I opted to do a narrow hem instead of the wider hem the pattern suggests. I turned under my hem allowance at 1 centimeter, pressed, and then I stitched as close to that seam allowance as possible. Then I very, very carefully trimmed off the seam allowance as close as I could to that stitch line. And then I turned over the hem once more to the wrong side, creating a very, very narrow hem. This is the way I like to do my narrow hems. I've done it this way for a long time and I usually get a really nice result. I stitched that final hem in place. I hemmed both the lining and main fabric in the same way. And with all of that done, the dress is complete and it's time for the final reveal. Okay guys, I finished my work on this beautiful green dress and here is the finished result. Overall, I am so happy with how this dress looks, so let's talk a little bit more about this project. So as you saw, the finished dress is fully lined and it's lined in the same fabric as the main fabric here on the outside, which gives it a really nice, neat finish. So first up, let's talk about the pattern itself and kind of my thoughts on all of that. So I think that the finished result is beautiful. I love the design of this pattern. I think it's really unique. I haven't seen any other sewing patterns out there that have this unique kind of neckline shape. So I really, really enjoy the finished shape of the pattern overall. I'm also glad that I decided to make this strappy design that doesn't have the cap sleeve kind of ruffle piece. I think it just looks really sleek and neat without that extra fabric there. So that was the right design choice for me. And on the back, you can see we have this wide kind of scoop back, which I think is really pretty. And having a little bit of back showing is a really, really flattering look. I like that the pattern includes instructions to make a fully lined invisible zipper in the back too, and my zipper turned out really well. This was a really time-consuming project. It was one of those projects that ended up taking much longer than I expected. Whenever there's princess seams and then when you're working with kind of a fussy fabric like this one, it can be really time consuming to sew all those pieces together. So I did find it was a very time-consuming project. So in terms of things I didn't really love about this pattern, there are a couple things. The first thing I'll mention is the sizing. So I didn't make a mock-up, which again, I usually don't do. If you're a viewer of my channel, you know I don't really like to do a lot of mock-ups unless it's a garment that's really fitted or it's something that I expect to be a bit challenging to get a good fit. So I sewed up a size 14 and my body measurements do correspond perfectly with the size 14. My measurements are 36-inch bust, 28-inch waist, 36-inch hips. So that's exactly what the envelope says for a size 14. But when I had finished sewing up this dress, the upper bodice near the bust, especially at the back, and the waist were several inches too big. So I ended up taking a good 4 inches out of the bust. I took it out from the center back seam. Technically, to do this properly, you should really take from the side seams as well as the back seam, but I was already almost done my project. I didn't want to kind of fuss around with this fabric again because it frays so easily. So I just took 4 inches out of the upper back area at the back of the dress, and I took about 2 to 3 inches out of the waist as well. So, overall I would say this pattern, at least on me, fit really, really big. I ended up taking it in quite a bit, and I took it in through the hips a little bit as well. So keep that in mind if you're planning on making this pattern. I think you could probably size down depending on what your measurements are, but maybe just measure the flat pattern pieces first so you have an idea of what the final result will be. I know the next time I make it, I'm probably going to have to do some serious grading between like 2 or 3 sizes to get the fit that I want. So let's also talk about the bust, because this is the number one thing I was most worried about before I made this project. I'd watched a couple other reviews of this pattern on YouTube. I'll pop those videos here or in the description box below for you to go check out. But a common thread I was hearing was that the bust was just not fitting people right. So for me, I would say the dress looks good if I'm not wearing a bra underneath, but if I was to wear a bra, then the bottom of the gathering of the bust would sit too high on me. So next time I make this, I would definitely lengthen the front straps by 1 or 2 inches so that the under bust sits where it's supposed to on me. And I do find it really interesting how different this dress looks on different people. So I've seen a few people wear it, and it seems to look really different on each person, just depending what your bust shape is like. I do think there's the potential to play around with inserting something like padding or an underwire. I was debating going that route, but in the end, I just decided that I wanted to leave it alone, leave it the way it is. But there's little to no support in this dress design, so if you do have a bigger chest, or if you're really picky about getting the perfect fit with the bust area, I would definitely make a mock-up. You might need to lengthen the straps, you might need to lower where the bust is, you might need to cut a much bigger cup. Like, there's a lot of potential modifications you might want to make there. So one last comment about the bust, I have seen some other creators add a second tie here at the top. So then you have 1 tie and 2 tie, and that can help to give a little bit of support. In my opinion, that's too bad that it's needed, because the whole appeal of this dress for me is this really unique bust shaping. So to have to kind of sacrifice that, I think does take something away from the dress for sure. So there was a little bit of hand sewing required to finish these straps, and surprisingly, I didn't find it to be too big of a deal. I'm not good at hand sewing at all. Like, I have no skills in that area, but I was still able to get a really neat result, and it feels really strong. Sometimes I find when I hand stitch something, I feel like it's not as strong just because I'm not as good at hand stitching, but this end result feels really, really nice. In terms of interfacing, I was pretty happy with what I did. For the neckline as well as the back neckline, I used a more stiff interfacing, and that was necessary for this kind of light drapey fabric to give it the stability it needed. So if you're working with a lightweight fabric with a lot of drape like I would definitely make sure you're interfacing appropriately. So I also interfaced the upper bust cup pieces in the lining fabric and the main fabric in an attempt to get this neckline really clean and stable, and the interfacing did a good job. Like, this is not really going to flop around, like, it's pretty stable because of that. For my cup, the outer piece, I did not use any interfacing just to give it a more drapey natural look, but on the lining piece, I did interface it just for a little bit more stability because I was using a lightweight fabric, and I think all my interfacing choices paid off well. In terms of the pattern and fabric pairing, I'm really happy with the fabric I chose. I really like the kind of slinky satin look. It looks like a really classy evening dress that you could wear out to dinner, but you could also throw it on top of a turtleneck with some sneakers and kind of dress it down a little bit, or maybe throw a sweater on top. I think there's lots of possibilities for this dress. So a couple of notes about the instructions. I did use the sew along video on YouTube as well as the paper traditional written instructions, and I did find they differed in a couple of places, the video compared to the written instructions, so that was a little bit confusing. And one other complaint I have about these instructions is they weren't always clear about certain things you might want to do to get a better result. Like they didn't always tell you to press your seams or clip your curved seams. Like I had to clip my seams of my neckline and notch the seams of my neckline in order to get it nice and smooth. And same thing at the back curved scoop neckline. I had to clip and notch my seams, otherwise I wasn't going to get a nice flat result. So I tried my best to show you that in the video so that if you want to make this dress, you can get a neat result as well. Overall, their instructions weren't horrible, they just weren't the best I've ever used. One other thing I would do differently next time is I would definitely try to finish the seams of my pieces before I sewed it up. This is something I'm pretty lazy about when it comes to satin, for the reason that I don't have a serger, and I find that my sewing machine has a lot of trouble finishing the seams of a satin fabric like this. My machine will tend to eat up the fabric and it just doesn't finish the seam very well. So that's why I didn't, but you guys could see in the video that my fabric was unraveling to an extreme, which made it hard to sew some of the finer details like the keyhole kind of scoop under the bust and things like that. So yeah, this is actually kind of a motivation for me to get a serger, because if I want to make any more garments this year with kind of slippery satin fabrics, I need to finish the seams, and I just don't think my sewing machine can really handle it. So maybe I'll be getting a serger soon, who knows. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know what you thought of the finished dress in the comments down below, and also let me know what you've been working on so far this year. Okay, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.